Dear guests from all over the world, my name is Stefano Sartorio, and I'm the Vice President of Mondo Internazionale, an international organization powered by youth, which operates in the field of cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. On behalf of the organization and of its president, Professor Michele Pavan, I wish to greet all the international youth connected through the World Food Forum today and here to listen at our event. I also wish to thank our amazing panelists, Professor Alessandro Cocchi, agro-economist and lecturer of development economics at the University of Florence, and Kaitlyn Rabe, director of our division Mondo Internazionale, G.E.O, for their valuable contributions. How do we think about our future if we don't consider our food systems? If we understand our world, we do see different economic models, innovation patterns, and cultural specificities. But we can be sure that at the basics of all of these, we will always find food systems. Food is what gives us life, what makes us grow, what enables entire populations to plan for their future and produce innovation that will benefit the whole humanity. That is why intelligent and resilient food systems must be a top priority for our generation while cooperating in building tomorrow's world. But the COVID-19 pandemic and other international crises, also connected to climate change, have proven us that much more should be done to efficiently handle our food systems. We must work together to prevent future crises in this regard. And this is the reason why we gather, all of us, here today. With Mondo Internazionale, we strongly believe that cooperation among young generations, with the support of the institutions, universities, and enterprises, can effectively contribute to positive outcomes when we talk about global challenges. We believe that inclusive agriculture, food production, and innovation can create jobs and eliminate hunger in rural areas globally, giving people a chance to feed their families and live a decent life. With this event, we aim at raising awareness among the young generations on the great opportunities in the agri-food sector, and also the responsibilities that this sector carries towards the civil society and global economy. Now, leaving the floor to our panelists, I wish to thank you all again for being here today, ready to empower ourselves to build the positive change we want to see in the world tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. And let me introduce myself. I am Gloria Marinsanti Rwakihembo, Deputy Secretary General of Mondo Internazionale, and I am today's moderator of the extraordinary multi-generational panel we are presenting to you today. So hello and welcome everyone to today's World Food Forum side event, Food Systems as Global Economy Accelerators. We are honored to have Professor Alessandro Cocchi, agro-economist and lecturer of development economics at the University of Florence, with more than 40 years experience in international development and with particular focus on the national and regional programming and identification, formulation, and evaluation of rural development programs, frequently responsible for leading international multidisciplinary expert teams in social-oriented and institutional strengthening projects in poor and vulnerable social contexts. And welcome to the second panelist, Kaitlyn Rabe, with a bachelor's degree in international studies from the Ohio State University and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Milan, current research director of Mondo Internazionale, G.E.O. So let's introduce today's event. Why food systems as global economy accelerators? Well, according to World Bank 2021, global extreme poverty rose in 2020 for the first time in over 20 years as the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic compounded the forces of conflict and climate change, which were already slowing poverty reduction progress. And about 120 million additional people are living in poverty today as a result of the pandemic, with the total expected to rise to about 150 million to the end of 2021. And the economic crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic is also expected to contribute to global unemployment for more than 200 million people next year, with women and youth workers worst hit. So the rising competition for scarce water is driving tensions and conflicts among stakeholders and exacerbating inequalities, or better say inequalities in access to water, especially for vulnerable populations, including the rural poor people, women, indigenous populations globally. So these are some of the issues, unfortunately, that we are all facing nowadays. But food systems and an inclusive agriculture, food production, and food innovation can create new jobs and eliminate hunger in rural areas globally, giving people the chance to feed their families and live a decent life. So today we are going to talk globally, and we are going to talk locally. So first of all, let's talk locally about the local economies. And I would like to ask our panelists, food systems as global economic accelerators, what does it mean, and what is the effect of food systems development on the local economies?
Professor, would you like to begin? You're muted.
Do you hear me now? Yes. Okay, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I will try to answer to your question, Gloria. What is the difference from a local focus and a global focus, talking about food systems? First of all, I would like to stress that a local economy is mainly based on smallholder farmers. Talking about Africa, talking about Latin America, in the majority of the areas of both Africa and Latin America, the majority of the farmers are smallholder producers. This means that their family economy is mainly based on self-sufficiency. An orientation toward the global economy would involve a complete change in economic patterns and cropping patterns as well. Global economy means specialization, high quality of production, low cost of production, high capital intensive production. And this is just the opposite of a self-sufficiency economic-based farming system. A food system based on self-sufficiency is high labor intensive, low capital intensive, and self-consumption oriented. So a global economy is generally completely different from a globalized economy. This doesn't mean that we have to avoid to orientate the local economy toward global economy, because the global economy means new opportunities. That's fine. But we have to take into considerations the constraints of local economy and to what extent local economy is exposed to external shocks, natural shocks or market shocks. I will take again the subject maybe later. I will leave the floor.
Thank you very much.
To Kaitlyn.
Thank you very much for your
I will
answer.
develop a little bit later these concepts anyway.
Thank you. So Kaitlyn, would you like to add something to the answer of the professor about global and local economies?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think what the irony of the title of this event is that the title food systems as global economy accelerators. Maybe we take for granted that a global economy acceleration is going to necessarily lead to a benefit throughout all facets of society, especially at the local and smallholder level. But it's not always and necessarily going to be accompanied by a local benefit or a benefit for the individual, for example. And I think the professor has obviously 40 plus years of working in the global South, and the way that this is reflected in the global South throughout the past decades. But I think what is really interesting is that it's a mirrored effect from the global South and within the global North. And I can say this from experience, that having grown up in the Corn Belt of the United States, for example, we're talking about the United States, a country that is more than self-sufficient in terms of food production. It produces enough for its entire population and for the populations of other countries. And so what this has led to is an acceleration of the national and of the global economy. But at the same time, the irony and the great paradox of Middle America anymore is that the same place where you find these massive fields of corn or soy, for example, aren't necessarily places where the farmers or the local people can access healthy food, for example. And they're not necessarily the parts of America where the economy is thriving. And so I find this to be a very interesting mirrored effect between the global South and Alessandro's experiences in the global South, but also a very related effect with a completely different image in the end, with a completely different result in the end within a country like the United States. And as Alessandro said, I think we're going to keep this theme throughout the entire event. So I'll leave the word back to you, Gloria.
Thank you very much. We are surely going to talk more about this topic. I would like to welcome our audience. I saw someone already greeting us. Welcome on board of this event. Feel free to ask questions throughout the event, and we will answer them at the end of the event in the last 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you very much for participating. And now we are going to the second question for our panelists. So we were talking about global and local economies, and how does the food system impact on the current international dynamics? Would you like to give some example of what is happening with the current situation in food systems? Maybe even referring to what happened with COVID-19 and the whole global situation. I'll leave the floor to our panelists.
May I start?
Yes.
I would like to turn your question upside down. Sorry. I would like to start talking about to what extent global economy can affect local economy. And then the other way around. I would like to make you an example. You were asking for examples. So more or less 20 years ago, at the end of the 90s, more or less, Vietnam became one of the major players in the coffee sector. They are actually the first or the second coffee producer in the world. And they, at the end of the 90s, they flooded the international market with coffee. Not high quality coffee at the beginning, but a lot of coffee. And the price of coffee, the international price of coffee went down. And these affected many coffee producers' countries traditionally not used to compete on the international market with other players like Vietnam. And at that time, I was in Central America, in Honduras, and I remember that the majority of the producers and the coffee producers' cooperatives were very, very worried about their capacity to to survive to this external shock. This means that when you deal with a world main commodity like coffee, for example, you are exposed to external shocks, either natural shocks like a hurricane or a quick decrease in international prices of the main commodity you are dealing with. So this means that the small producer, if it is not open and flexible to change quickly his cropping pattern, if he is not diversified in his plot, he risks to be impacted by the consequence of the global economy in a way that he will not be able to survive. Definitely, all recent studies about food insecurity in Central America demonstrate that the people most exposed to food insecurity are just the small coffee producers, which base their economy on coffee and no other crops, because they rely on a cash crop only and not on vegetables, fruits, and small animals and so on, in order to have a diversified family economy. This means that if you are a small producer and you want to face the challenge of the international market, you have to be well equipped in terms of cropping pattern, in terms of producers associations or cooperatives, access to services like credit, insurance, and so on, that many times are not present in the third country or in the not developed or in the developing countries. When Kaitlyn was mentioning the Corn Belt, we also have to take into consideration that that's for sure, the Corn Belt is a typical globalized production model open to the international market, but at the same time, the local producers have access to a lot of services like credit, insurance, technical assistance, state subsidies, and so on, while the small producers in the third world are not open, they do not have access to these kind of services. So the impact of globalization in the north of the United States can't be the same in the south of the world. To what extent local economy in the third world can impact on the global economy? The other way around. There is the possibility for the small producers to organize themselves in associations, cooperative, with the help of the international cooperation for development, in order to strengthen their capacity to face the challenges of the international market and to reinforce their ability in terms of management, production techniques, good practices, and so on, in order to restructure the value chain and to make the added value more closer to the production and not to commercialization. So the restructuring of the value chain is basic for making globalization benefiting also the small producers.
Thank you very much. In fact, global value chains are so fundamental for the food systems and in order to preserve the local populations. Kaitlyn, would you like to add something to the answer of Professor Cocchi?
Yeah, so just like Professor Cocchi, I think I'm going to separate this into two different parts, because Professor Cocchi was also speaking about the theme of specialization and hyper-specialization, and that specialization in a country like the United States or in for example, European countries is financially sustainable for the producers because the producers have access to things like crop insurance, for example, which, for example, giving the case of India, and India a smallholder based in India is susceptible to price variations in a crop that are 20 times more volatile than the price variations in the United States, just to give an example, because of the fact that an American farmer is protected by insurance. So this is the negative effect of the tendency towards the specialization that we see as a part of a globalized food system. But at the same time, it's not that globalization can be considered, globalization of the food systems anyways, it can be considered neither a positive or a negative thing. We have to think about how it's implemented, just like any other paradigm. And so just as Alessandro was saying, if we think about, for example, smallholders in the global south, if we can give them, or if they have the tools in order to form a cooperative, for example, they're going to be much less likely to face such a volatility in the prices. And it also gives them a greater platform to speak on a political level, on an international level. So for example, if I'm buying a spice that's been imported from a cooperative in Indonesia, that definitely is going to have a beneficial effect for the smallholder based in Indonesia. But if we are focusing globalization on specialization efforts and on just producing more with one farmer, that's not going to lead to a greater benefit for that farmer or for the consumer in the end. So essentially, we have to be very attentive to how a globalized food system is implemented in the end, as opposed to saying it's a positive or a negative paradigm.
Yes, I agree. So specialization of food systems is indeed a precondition of globalization. And according to you, what are the trade-offs of specialization in the global economy? You are muted.
Sorry. Specialization means different things. The requirements of a globalized market are high, as I told you before, high quality in terms of production quality, low cost of production, and high capital intensive production. But there is also another aspect, quality, and in terms of organization, production, a food system facing the challenges of a globalized market must be strengthened in terms of organization. They have to be able to organize themselves in terms of work organization, value chain organization, post-production, post-harvest, handling, packaging, transport, dealing with all the requirements of export chain and so on. And this is not affordable for small producers alone, and in many cases, not even for their organizations, which are not very well funded, not very well organized, cut off from the main roads. And that's why there is another aspect, technological aspect. For example, if you want to produce maize for the international market, you have to produce in bulk, you have to produce a lot of maize and to supply the international market with a constant quantity, a constant supply. And this requires a high technology, hybrids, for example, hybrid seeds, hybrid seeds require a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, and chemical inputs in general, which are not affordable for the smallholder farmers. Many times hybrids are much more vulnerable to drought, to high rainfalls, to high precipitations, and in many cases, local varieties result to be much more resistant to pests, disease, drought, and other adversities. Less produce, the yields are less than what you could obtain with an hybrid. Yields are generally not matching standards or international requirements, but at the same time, they represent a sort of insurance that anyway you will produce something. The dependency of the international market for the supply of hybrids make the small producer totally depending on the international market and external supply of agricultural inputs. And this opened the room to propose another subject, which is the food sovereignty. Food sovereignty means the capacity of a community to have control of the agricultural inputs, the agricultural way to access market, and the access to land, credit, and capital. This capacity is hampered by the globalization because international market offers everything, but in order to have access to the international market, you have to have basic requirement in terms of access to capital, access to communication, access to roads, access to institutions, and so on, which is not affordable for the small producers. It is not affordable. It is not possible for the majority of the local communities in rural areas in the south of the world.
Yes,
so
that's an issue.
Exactly. So in order to access global market, you have to rely on a number of requirements, a number of items that not all the local communities, not all the rural communities are in the position to have or to obtain. And anytime they try to address their food system toward the global market, many times they fail, or they have consequences in terms of shocks, vulnerability, and increase of food insecurity. It is not so easy to change the pattern and to address a local community which is mainly based and traditionally based on self-sufficiency and self-food production toward a monetary economy, which is a completely different pattern. Global economy is based on financial economy. Local economy is based on kind, food, and exchanging kind, which is completely different. I would say from the anthropological point of view as well. And this is another story, of course.
And it will be really interesting to hear.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about it later. Kaitlyn, would you like to add something to the food sovereignty topic?
Yes, I've been doing a lot of reading on the topic of food sovereignty, and it's really interesting that we can find many different definitions, but there is maybe more of a grassroots or activist branch that defines it as the ability of each individual to control how his or her food is produced, what type of food they are eating, and there are many different types of food sovereignty, but I think the most agreed upon definition is also that of a nation being able, or a group of people being able to decide or having self-sufficiency in regards to food. And I think Alessandro gave some examples in regards to technologies and rural peoples being able to access the technologies necessary to produce certain types of crops. I'm going to take this a little bit more into the political realm, for example, and speak about the role of food security and food sovereignty in geopolitics these days. And essentially what we're seeing, for example, especially in these last couple of years, is the idea of food sovereignty being an important development in international agreements and in relations between countries. And I think of the example of China, for example, that has a population that essentially is very difficult to meet their alimentary needs, their food needs. And so if before China also depended on the United States in part for their food needs, recently, because that supply has been cut off, as we can say, China has found other ways to meet its own food needs and thus obtain food sovereignty or self-sufficiency in regards to their food production. Also, by going to nations in Africa and receiving some of their food production from African nations. And so I think we take for granted the importance of food sovereignty in international relations that we see today. So Alessandro spoke about this on a local level. I'm taking this also to more of a global, international level. So yes, another way in which we see, I think, the local being mirrored in a certain way on a global level, or the situation in the global south also being mirrored in the global north. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kaitlyn. So we were talking about free trade agreements, international dynamics. Professor Cocchi, would you like to add something to the topic of multilateral and free trade agreements, regional agreements, and what are the current dynamics on the topic?
Okay. I'm not an expert in food trade, trade agreements. What I can say is just, according to my experience, that there are different approaches. The United States, for example, always prefer to negotiate free trade agreements state by state, individually, unilaterally. The approach of the European Union is much more based on regions. Traditionally, the European Union tried to promote the European model in different areas of the world. In Central America, the European Union is supporting the Central American Parliament and had been supporting the Central American Parliament for 30 years, more or less. The same in the Andean community, encompassing Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Bolivia as well. So the negotiation of free trade agreements is always carried out by the European Union in terms of regional trade agreements in order to avoid a competition between areas of the same regions producing the same goods, producing the same fruits or vegetables or dairy products and so on. So if you want to promote a regional approach in terms of economic community, you have to negotiate free trade agreements at regional level with a multilateral approach. Nevertheless, it is sure that free trade agreements are quite often based on a disbalanced approach, some asymmetry. Everybody knows that the European agricultural sector is supported by a lot of incentives and a lot of funds channeled by the European Commission to the different states and to the different regions within the European Union for supporting the agricultural sector everywhere. Not the same in the regions where we are negotiating free trade agreements. This means that the possibility of these countries to compete with products coming from the European Union is not harmonized, let's say, not based on the same facilities. Just an example. A few years ago, a free trade agreement was negotiated between the European Union and Colombia within the free trade agreement with the Andean countries. The dairy sector in Colombia is quite strong. It means milk, cheese, butter, and so on. The dairy sector is quite strong in Colombia, but not able to compete with dairy products coming from Europe in terms of prices, because dairy products in Europe are subsidized. So in the framework of the free trade agreement between Colombia and the European Union, it was negotiated a sort of grace period allowing Colombia to update, adjust, improve their productivity level and arriving to the enforcement of the agreement with a reinforced capacity to compete in the dairy sector. I was responsible for monitoring this process. That's why I know the subject. This is just one of the mechanisms allowing to reduce the asymmetries between different countries when a trade agreement is set out. Nevertheless, one of the accusations, can we say accusations? Can we allegement made from the international market to the European Union is that the European Union is hiding tariffs or hiding barriers through the high level of safety requirements. Food safety is another face of the coin. Food safety means to what extent I'm available to accept food from the rest of the world, but not matching my requirement in terms of safety. The European Union have the highest threshold in terms of food safety parameters, and this creates substantial barriers to the incoming food products from the rest of the world. And this is one of the let's say arguments against the European Union during the negotiation for free trade agreements, that we are using safety criteria, food safety regulations for creating trade barriers, which is true on one side, and not true on the other side. Look what's happening now after the Brexit. Great Britain was sure to be able to negotiate with the United States a free trade agreement, opening their market to the American market and solving their supply problems. But the food safety regulations in the United States are much lower in terms of quality than what has been adopted so far in Great Britain, which corresponds to what had been adopted in the European Union. And this creates a new asymmetry, because the British consumer is no longer available to accept low quality food coming from abroad. So it's quite complicated, but it's interesting to introduce the issue of food safety within the framework of free trade agreements, because it's part of the game.
It is indeed. Thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear. And I would like to welcome the new auditors that are being part of our audience. And I would like to thank them for their participation and invite them to ask questions about what we have been talking about, which was the global economics, the impact of food systems of the global economy. And we have been talking globally and we have been talking locally. So the last topic was about free trade agreements. And so I would add, we need to stress how important it is, the role of institutions in assuring that the food systems are being organized so that the local and the global remains somehow equal, and we all can join of the benefits of the food system economy. So, Kaitlyn, would you like to add something about the food safety topic?
I didn't have anything to say on the food safety, as a matter of fact, but I would like to add something about the agreements and especially the free trade agreements, the potential for free trade agreements in not only accelerating the global economy, but also maybe re-seeing the paradigm, re-seeing our vision of a free trade agreement in order that it also affects local economies in a positive way. And I think what Alessandro was saying previously about the asymmetries and the asymmetries of free trade agreements within food systems, I think can fit into the greater idea of this new idea of South-South cooperation and the potentials that we see in South-South cooperation. And the leaders of South-South cooperation tend to be the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And I think what the potentials of this new type of cooperation is that, as we said before, if there is more of a regional focus as opposed to a unilateral focus, if it is applied to multiple countries and preferably countries of a similar geographical location and a similar socioeconomic context, I think we can begin to reimagine our idea of free trade agreements in a way that eliminates the asymmetries, both on a geopolitical scale and on a socioeconomic scale. And so I think when we think of the title of this event, Food Systems as Global Economy Accelerators, of course, free trade agreements have the potential to accelerate the global economy, but only if they are implemented in a multilateral way, and preferably between countries of a similar socioeconomic standing, can they actually have the potential to benefit local levels of human development, local producers, and local consumers. And I think, yes, that's what I would like to say about the concept of asymmetries and the new potential for South-South cooperation.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. Very insightful. And Professor Cocchi, would you like to add something on the topic? Or I would also like to go back to the people. So we have been talking about the regulations, the agreements, and the institutions which are fundamental. I would also like to go back to the local aspect and to talk again about what is the anthropological aspect of the global food systems and economics. So I'll leave the floor to Professor Cocchi, and if you would like to add something to the topics that we have been talking about, we are really happy to hear you.
Thank you. I perfectly agree with what Kaitlyn said about the need for a strengthening of South-South cooperation. I'm sure that that's the way the European Union as well is stressing the importance of fostering the cooperation between countries belonging to the same areas. It is not so easy because in many times the economies of these countries, similar countries, for example, both belonging to the tropics, are in competition for placing their products on the same markets, and the main markets are placed in the north of the planet. And so both countries belonging to the same tropical areas are competing for placing the same products in the north of the American continental or in Europe, and they face the same problems in competing on the global market, which complicates the agreement, because they are competitors at the end of the day, and they are not always available to develop alliance on the global market. There is another. It can be interesting to promote exchange of experience, and definitely many projects financed by the European Union are promoting exchange of experience between African countries, for example, and Latin American countries. I have been recently surprised meeting people from Latin America who had experience in Africa in tropical fruit production, for example, and they were very, very happy of the experience of this kind of technical exchanges and so on. This is excellent from the scientific point of view, from the technical point of view. There are international research networks encompassing different areas of the world. The CGR network, for example, is an international network for the agricultural research on not only on tropical products, but for everything, rice, maize, wheat, barley, and so on. And but I see the difficulties, I recognize the difficulties in promoting free trade agreements between countries belonging to the same climatic areas and competing on the same market for the same target market, which is always placed in the north of the planet: China, Russia, Europe, and North America. So we had to be very realistic The cooperation, the South-South cooperation can be at a first stage promoted, but mainly in the framework of an exchange of experience, agricultural research, and things like that. Trade agreements maybe will be the second step, but at this stage, I recognize the difficulties. Anthropology, you introduced a very heavy subject, anthropology. I am absolutely convinced that anthropology is an essential tool which should be adopted at the beginning of any kind of intervention in the south of the world, but not only in the south, also in the north of the world, as a precondition for understanding the feasibility of an intervention, the feasibility of an action in the social context we are going to operate. I remember many years ago an immense irrigation project in the north of Nigeria. The engineers were absolutely convinced of the value of their projects. Excellent irrigation schemes, an excellent dam, an excellent organization proposal, and they didn't take into consideration the social and cultural patterns of the areas where the project was going to be located. And at the end of the day, after billions of dollars spent in that project, the project was a failure. And it was not a failure because of a bad design or any bad calculation. It was not a math problem. It was just a problem of acceptability. People were forced to work by night for respecting the irrigation term, and they didn't take into consideration that in many areas of Africa, including north of Nigeria, the night is populated by ghosts and spirits, and you don't go to the fields by night. That's all. You don't go to the fields by night. And this was not, you can imagine an Italian engineer at that time, 40 years ago. He was absolutely away from the concept. But this was one of the reasons why this irrigation scheme failed. So anthropological patterns should be considered as a basic knowledge before developing any kind of development project. I gave you an extreme example, of course, but just for memorizing the issue.
Thank you very much. Kaitlyn, would you like to add something? And then we have the last few minutes to answer to some questions that we have from our audience.
Yeah, I think my last comment before the questions come in is just going to come off of Alessandro. But I think in my little experience that I've had in international cooperation for development, I think the thing that I've taken away from it all is, and we can also apply this to food systems specifically, is if we try to apply what we see as a global concept on a local level without considering the needs of the local level and without interacting first at the local level with the people, the project will not be very useful for anyone in the end. The most productive and fruitful projects in international cooperation come from an initial exchange with in this case, for example, the producers or the farmers or the local people. And that's how we go and we understand little nuances that maybe we don't immediately see because we're so busy thinking at a global level that we don't understand the local at first. So I think there's a lot of humility that we have to have before assuming that what we assume is a global, international, correct concept is actually not going to be that way for everyone. And this also applies for food production processes. It applies to access to food, that maybe the foods that we think people want and we think people need are not necessarily the foods that they want and they need. And so it applies to both the producer and the consumer in this sense.
Thank you very much, Kaitlyn. So we have 5 minutes to answer the questions that we have from our audience. I would like to sum up some of the interesting questions that we have, to also sum up today's event, because we have been talking about local and global, and lastly about how the two topics are interacting with each other. So the question is, what is the role of food associations and aggregations of local farmers in determining a more resilient local food systems? Can these organizations bring local producers on a regional path or to agricultural development? And in the end, what is the general pattern, in your opinion, more towards global food systems or more towards local food systems? So I leave you the floor, and thank you very much.
Alessandro, I can take the first question and you can go for the second.
Okay, perfect.
Right, perfect. So I believe, oh yeah, go.
Yes, as I said before, farmers associations, farmers cooperative, any kind of collective way of producing is basic for reinforcing both local economy and the possibility to enter a globalized market. Is a precondition for everything. As I said before, it is absolutely necessary for reinforcing food security at local level to have access to external services like input supply, credit, insurance mechanism possibly, which is quite difficult at the moment, and other services like technical assistance, agricultural advice, and so on. It is almost impossible to reach each farmer with these services because farmers are living in immense territories. Farmer settlements are scattered in immense and vast areas in Africa, like in Latin America, Asia, and so on. So the only way to reach these communities is just to organize them, to identify local team leaders, local leaders, to prepare them, to train them in order to let them replicate the messages to the local community, and to channel some services through these leaders or local technicians trained at this purpose. So associations are essential both for giving and receiving, for channeling the products outside the community, but also for receiving services from outside, from local institutions, national institutions, international cooperation for development projects, and so on.
And actually, I think, Alessandro, you would be better adept at answering the second question. So I think I'm going to just give an example of what Alessandro was saying of the rural peoples living in the middle of nowhere. I saw an example in Zanzibar where a woman who was living in the middle of an island in the mangroves, and that was only accessible by car 3 hours a day from the main island, for example. After she had started to take part in a cooperative, for example, all of a sudden she knew how to save money. Her coworkers, not necessarily something that, it's not necessarily knowledge that we brought, but just bridging the literal gap between this woman and a cooperative of people who already knew how to save money and who already knew the best techniques, that they essentially knew everything already, and they transmitted this knowledge to her. This is just an example of how powerful a cooperative is in reaching the most, how can we say, isolated peoples. And the second question as to if the tendency is more towards global or local systems, I think I will leave to the agri-economist.
Well, I am not, I don't have any prejudice against globalization per se, as such. I mean, globalization is not the ideal. It depends on how it's managed and who is the winner and who is the loser. I mean, a globalization process must be based on the removal of asymmetries. It must be based on equity. It must be based on equality, pardon me. It must be based on equal starting conditions. Otherwise, globalization is an accelerator of diversities. Globalization is an accelerator of inequality. So, if we are talking about accelerators, we have to be very aware that globalization is an accelerator of inequalities and asymmetries, because the starting point is unequal for everybody. The multinationals companies already exist. The small producers have not access to the same services and to the same facilities as the big companies, already big players on the global market. So we have to think on asymmetries. We have to focus our attention on inequality before starting a globalization process, thinking that globalization is good and for sure benefiting also local economy. It is not given for granted. It can even amplify the differences. It can even amplify asymmetries and inequality. So I don't have a preference. Well, I have a preference. I'm much more oriented, because of my experience, on local economy than global economy. We also have to take into consideration the impact of globalization on climate change. Transportation, the cold chains, a lot of technical implications of globalization are completely against what we should do for mitigating the effects of climate change. Local economy is much more structured and much more fit for be climate smart. Globalization is based on long distance transportation, big boat, big airplanes, and so on. And this should be taken into consideration beyond any economic model, beyond any political orientation as well. I mean, climate change is going to be a crucial round point that we have to consider, even in the evaluation of what we have to promote in terms of economic development model. And I think that local economy is retaking a crucial role, a pivotal role in fighting against global warming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the very insightful interventions, and thank you for our audience for following us during this event. We have, our time is up, so we are concluding this event, and maybe we will talk about these topics in another occasion. Thank you very much to our panelists, Professor Alessandro Cocchi and Kaitlyn Rabe, for being part of this event and sharing their knowledge with us. And thank you
Thanks
to the World Food Forum for having us on their platforms. I would like to make a shout out to Mondo Internazionale, our association, for being part of this event, and come see us at mondointernazionale.org. Thank you very much for your participation, and have a nice day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Goodbye.
Thank you,
very
everyone.
much.
Bye.